The infinite darkness, the untold story of the Epstein Files. The message arrived at the FBI's New York field office on a humid August afternoon in 1996, slipped under the door like a whisper that the world wasn't ready to hear. Maria Farmer, a young artist who had been working for Jeffrey Epstein at his Ohio estate, had witnessed something that shattered her sense of safety forever. She reported sexual abuse of minors. She gave names. She described a network of exploitation that seemed too vast, too protected, too impossibly dark to be real. The FBI took her statement, filed it away, and did nothing. For nearly a decade that file gathered dust while Epstein continued his operations with impunity, his wealth and connections forming an impenetrable shield around crimes that would eventually shock the world. It would take until March 2005 for the machinery of justice to finally creak into motion, and even then, it moved with a hesitancy that would define the case for the next 2 decades. A 14-year-old girl in Palm Beach, Florida, returned home with a story that her stepmother couldn't ignore. The child had been recruited from her high school by another teenager with the promise of easy money, $200 to give a wealthy man a massage at his mansion. What happened inside that waterfront estate on El Brillo Way would become the template for hundreds of similar stories spanning decades. A methodology of exploitation so calculated, so industrial in its precision, that investigators would later struggle to comprehend its scope. The Palm Beach Police Department, led by Chief Michael Ryder and Detective Giuffre, began what they believed would be a straightforward investigation. They quickly discovered it was anything but. Underage girls, many of them 15 and 16 years old, began coming forward with eerily similar accounts. They were recruited by friends or by Epstein's assistants, brought to the mansion for massages, and then subjected to sexual abuse. Some were paid to recruit others, creating a pyramid scheme of exploitation that ensnared vulnerable children from broken homes, from foster care, from the margins of a wealthy community where desperation and privilege collided. By May 2006, Ryder and Ricari believed they had enough evidence to charge Epstein with multiple counts of unlawful sex with a minor, serious felonies that could have put him away for decades. But then something unprecedented happened. State Attorney Barry Krischer, the chief prosecutor for Palm Beach County, took the unusual and controversial step of refusing to authorize the charges. Instead, he sent the case to a grand jury, a body that would ultimately indict Epstein on only a single count of soliciting prostitution, a misdemeanor that treated the child victims as commercial sex workers rather than exploited minors. The indictment triggered an immediate outcry from the Palm Beach Police Department. Chief Ryder went public with his accusations that Epstein was receiving special treatment, suggesting that political influence and wealth had corrupted the judicial process. Behind the scenes, the FBI had quietly opened an investigation they called Operation Leap Year. But this federal probe would soon take a turn that survivors and law enforcement officials would find equally troubling. In 2007, as federal prosecutors prepared a comprehensive indictment that could have put Epstein away for life, a series of secret negotiations began that would eventually become known as the deal of a lifetime. Alexander Acosta, then the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of Florida, entered into prolonged discussions with Epstein's high-powered legal team, a roster that included Alan Dershowitz, Ken Starr, and other luminaries of the legal world. For a year, these negotiations dragged on while Epstein continued to operate freely. His lawyers engaged in aggressive tactics, investigating the victims' families, questioning their credibility, and painting them as unreliable witnesses motivated by greed. The result was the Non-Prosecution Agreement of 2008, a document so extraordinary in its leniency that it would eventually cost Acosta his position as Secretary of Labor years later. Under this secret deal, Epstein pleaded guilty to 2 state charges, soliciting prostitution and soliciting prostitution from a minor, and received an 18-month sentence. But the true scandal lay in what was hidden from the victims and the public. The federal government agreed not to prosecute Epstein or his co-conspirators for any federal crimes, effectively granting immunity to anyone involved in his network. Epstein served most of his sentence in a work release program that allowed him to leave the county jail for 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, continuing to conduct business from his office while his victims believed justice was being served. When Epstein walked out of jail in July 2009 after serving just 13 months, the case seemed closed. But one victim refused to let it die. Virginia Roberts Giuffre, who had been recruited by Ghislaine Maxwell when she was just 16 years old working as a spa attendant at Donald Trump's Mar-a-Lago club, filed a lawsuit that would slowly unravel the secrets Epstein had paid so dearly to bury. Her accusations were explosive, not just against Epstein, but against the powerful men she claimed she had been trafficked to, including Prince Andrew, Duke of York, and other world leaders. For the next decade, Epstein lived as a free man, continuing to travel the world on his private jets, visiting his properties in New York, New Mexico, the U.S. Virgin Islands, and Paris. He registered as a sex offender in multiple jurisdictions but faced little scrutiny. The U.S. Marshals Service and the FBI, despite knowing his history, failed to properly monitor his international travel. Flight logs would later reveal that he flew to France, Austria, Monaco, and Morocco, often without reporting his movements as required by the international Megan's Law. The world might have forgotten Jeffrey Epstein if not for the dogged persistence of investigative journalist Julie K. Brown. In November 2018, the Miami Herald published a series of articles that would reignite the case with explosive force. Brown's reporting focused on the sweetheart deal cut by Acosta, revealing the depth of the corruption that had allowed Epstein to escape meaningful punishment. The articles triggered a public outcry that made it impossible for federal authorities to continue ignoring the case. On July 6, 2019, federal agents arrested Epstein at Teterboro Airport in New Jersey as he arrived on his private jet from Paris. The Southern District of New York, under U.S. Attorney Jeffrey Berman, filed charges of sex trafficking of minors and conspiracy to commit sex trafficking, crimes that carried potential sentences of decades in prison. Unlike the Florida case, this prosecution appeared relentless. Prosecutors alleged that Epstein had abused dozens of underage girls between 2002 and 2005 in New York and Florida, paying them to recruit others in a scheme that mirrored the Palm Beach allegations from years earlier. The arrest set off panic among Epstein's powerful associates. Within days, Alexander Acosta resigned as Secretary of Labor, his role in the 2008 deal finally catching up with him. But the reckoning that survivors had waited decades for would never come in the form of a trial. On August 10, 2019, Jeffrey Epstein was found dead in his cell at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan. The official ruling was suicide by hanging, but the circumstances, he had been taken off suicide watch despite a previous attempt, his cellmate had been transferred, and the guards failed to check on him for hours, fueled conspiracy theories that persist to this day. With Epstein's death, the focus shifted to his longtime companion, Ghislaine Maxwell. The daughter of media tycoon Robert Maxwell, she had been Epstein's girlfriend, closest associate, and alleged co-conspirator for years. Survivors described her as the lady of the house, who managed the recruitment of girls, instructed them on how to please Epstein, and sometimes participated in the abuse herself. After Epstein's arrest, Maxwell had gone into hiding, eventually being tracked down by the FBI to $1 million estate in New Hampshire, where she was arrested on July 2, 2020. Maxwell's trial in late 2021 revealed the inner workings of the Epstein empire in devastating detail. Survivors testified about the recruitment process, the abuse they suffered at Epstein's multiple properties, and the psychological trauma that followed them into adulthood. The jury convicted Maxwell on 5 of 6 charges, including sex trafficking of a minor, and she was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison, a measure of justice, but one that felt hollow to many who knew that the full truth remained buried under layers of legal settlements, sealed documents, and the silence of powerful men. For years, the Epstein Files remained a subject of intense speculation. Conspiracy theorists imagined cabals of global elites participating in satanic rituals, while survivors and their advocates fought in court for the release of documents that would reveal the true extent of Epstein's network. The flight logs of his private jets, particularly the Boeing 727 known as the Lolita Express, became symbols of the secrecy and privilege that had protected him. Names that appeared in those logs included former presidents Bill Clinton and Donald Trump, Prince Andrew, Harvard professor Alan Dershowitz, former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers, Microsoft co-founder Bill Gates, and dozens of other billionaires, scientists, and celebrities. The House of Representatives, responding to public pressure, took matters into its own hands. In November 2025, a bipartisan bill called the Epstein Files Transparency Act was signed into law, requiring the Department of Justice to publish all unclassified records related to the investigation. The legislation specifically mandated the release of flight logs, travel records, communications, and materials related to Ghislaine Maxwell's prosecution, while protecting victim identities. When the first official tranche of documents was released in December 2025 under this new law, it confirmed much of what had been suspected while raising new questions. The flight logs showed extensive travel by Epstein and his associates between 1990 and 2019, including trips to his private island, Little St. James, in the U.S. Virgin Islands, a location survivors referred to as Pedophile Island. The logs documented visits by politicians, academics, and business leaders, though they did not necessarily indicate that all passengers were aware of or participated in criminal activity. Perhaps more disturbing were the documents revealing the systemic failures that had allowed Epstein to operate for so long. FBI interview notes showed that agents had been aware of allegations against Epstein since Maria Farmer's 1996 report, but failed to act for nearly a decade. Financial records demonstrated how Epstein used his wealth to influence investigations, making charitable donations to organizations connected to law enforcement, and hiring private investigators to intimidate witnesses and their families. The documents also shed light on the post-2008 period, when Epstein should have been closely monitored as a registered sex offender. Despite requirements to report international travel, he continued to fly abroad frequently, visiting properties in Paris and other locations where he allegedly continued to abuse young women. The U.S. Marshals Service, responsible for monitoring sex offenders under the International Megan's Law, failed to detect his undisclosed trips to multiple countries in March 2019, just months before his arrest. In the political arena, the Epstein Files became a weapon of mutual destruction. Democrats on the House Oversight Committee released documents showing connections between Epstein and Trump allies like Steve Bannon, while Republicans countered with documents highlighting Bill Clinton's extensive travel on Epstein's jets and stays at his properties. A 2003 birthday book compiled for Epstein, recently released, contained messages from hundreds of well-wishers including now President Trump, former Microsoft executive Nathan Myhrvold, and numerous other prominent figures, though most messages were innocuous birthday greetings rather than evidence of wrongdoing. The most recent developments in late 2025 and early 2026 have focused on the U.S. Virgin Islands, where Epstein maintained his primary residence, and where local officials have been accused of turning a blind eye to his activities for years. Delegate Stacey Plaskett, the territory's representative in Congress, faced scrutiny over text message exchanges with Epstein and campaign contributions she received from him, though she maintained that their contact was minimal and related to economic development issues. Meanwhile, Ghislaine Maxwell remains incarcerated, having been moved in late 2025 from a low-security facility in Florida to a minimum-security prison camp in Texas following an interview with Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche. In that interview, Maxwell reportedly denied any wrongdoing and claimed she never witnessed Trump engaging in inappropriate activity, a statement that some interpreted as an attempt to curry favor with the current administration. The story of the Epstein Files is not merely the story of one man's depravity or one woman's complicity. It is a chronicle of how wealth, influence, and institutional failure can combine to create impunity for the most horrific crimes. It reveals how law enforcement agencies tasked with protecting the vulnerable can be intimidated or co-opted by the powerful. It demonstrates how the legal system, with its emphasis on settlements and non-prosecution agreements, can be manipulated to silence victims and bury the truth. For the survivors, the release of documents provides a measure of validation but little closure. Many have spent decades fighting to be heard against a chorus of accusations that they were liars, gold diggers, or willing participants in their own exploitation. Virginia Giuffre, who settled defamation lawsuits against several of Epstein's associates, but never stopped advocating for other victims, died by suicide in 2025, her death a tragic reminder of the lasting trauma inflicted by Epstein and his network. As the document releases continue, with thousands of pages still being reviewed and redacted, the full scope of Epstein's crimes and the extent of his network may never be completely known. The flight logs show who traveled with him, but not what they knew or did. The financial records show payments to associates, but not always the purpose of those payments. The emails and schedules show meetings between Epstein and powerful figures, but not necessarily the content of those meetings. What remains clear is that Jeffrey Epstein operated a criminal enterprise that exploited the most vulnerable members of society for the gratification of the elite, and that he did so with the knowledge or willful ignorance of law enforcement, prosecutors, and a social circle that included some of the most influential people in the world. The files reveal a system that failed at every level, a system where a report to the FBI in 1996 could be ignored for a decade, where a man accused of abusing dozens of children could receive a slap on the wrist and continue his crimes, where a registered sex offender could travel the world unmolested by authorities, and where the truth could be buried under classified markings and legal settlements for 20 years. The Epstein Files are more than historical documents. They are a mirror reflecting the darkest aspects of power and privilege in American society. They show how the wealthy can purchase silence, how institutions can be corrupted, and how the cries of the powerless can be drowned out by the machinery of influence. As the documents continue to emerge, they force us to confront uncomfortable questions about who knew what and when, about the price of justice in a society where some people are too important to be held accountable, and about whether the systems designed to protect children can ever truly function when the accused possess unlimited resources to evade consequence. The story ends not with a conclusion, but with a warning. Jeffrey Epstein is dead, Ghislaine Maxwell is imprisoned, but the conditions that allowed their crimes to flourish, inequality, institutional cowardice, the worship of wealth, and the silencing of victims, remain very much alive. The files tell us what happened, but they also ask us what we are willing to tolerate, whom we are willing to believe, and whether we have the courage to ensure that such darkness cannot find purchase in the light again.